The rain had just begun to fall when the laughter cut through the parade ground. Sharp, mocking, unrestrained. A group of young recruits pointed toward the woman standing at the edge of the formation, her uniform pressed, her boots gleaming with polish that spoke of discipline, not vanity. "Cadet," one of them sneered. "Don't stand there like you belong. This ground isn't for tourists." She didn't answer. She didn't blink. She simply stood at attention, her eyes fixed forward, as though the insults hurled at her dissolved before they ever reached her. The silence unsettled them more than any argument would have. Her silence carried weight. It was not the silence of weakness. It was the silence of someone who had walked longer roads than they could yet imagine. And then, from across the field, a Marine officer rose slowly to his feet. His voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of a battlefield that none of these young men had ever seen. "Iron Wolf," he said, each syllable striking like a gavel in a courtroom. "Stand by." The recruits froze. The laughter died. The air itself seemed to stop moving. Her name was Elena Ward. To those who didn't know her, she was just another uniformed body on a base swollen with cadets. To those who looked more closely, there were details they missed but could have seen if only they'd paid attention. The way her stance betrayed no hesitation, the way her boots carried the scuffs of deserts and mountains that had no parade stands, the way her eyes carried the distant weight of someone who had lived through silence and loss. Elena had once been more than a soldier. She had been part of a team known only by its call sign, Iron Wolf Unit. A name whispered across deployments, a name that didn't appear in glossy magazines or ceremony speeches, but in hushed stories traded between those who owed their lives to men and women who never sought credit. Her body still carried the evidence. A line of scar tissue along her side where shrapnel had carved its way through flesh. Faded burns along her hands from pulling another soldier out of a burning convoy. Her knee, which tightened in the rain like an unwelcome reminder of the day she'd refused to stay down, refused to let another Marine be carried away alone. But none of these stories were visible to the young recruits before her. They saw only a woman. They saw age lines etched from nights without sleep. They saw the absence of rank pinned to her collar because she wore no visible insignia. And in their ignorance, they mistook survival for weakness. Years earlier, Elena Ward had served in a war zone so unforgiving that sand itself seemed like a weapon. Days blended into nights under the glare of an unrelenting sun, the air laced with smoke and grit that clung to lungs and uniforms alike. Her unit had been tasked with escorting supply convoys across hostile territory. It was supposed to be routine. It never was. On one of those missions, the explosion came without warning. A roadside device tore through steel and flame. The convoy scattered, men yelling orders drowned beneath fire. Elena had been thrown against the door of her vehicle, ribs breaking under the impact. But when the fire rose, she had crawled into it. She had dragged a screaming sergeant out through a curtain of flame. Her hands blistered, her lungs filled with smoke. But she did not stop until every man breathing had been carried out. When the dust settled, her name was written in reports that would never see daylight. She didn't care. She didn't serve for recognition. She served because somewhere in her there was a vow etched in silence. If I can stand, I will not let another fall. Now, years later, Elena had come to the base not to parade, not to lecture, not even to be recognized. She had come to visit an old friend, an instructor who once carried her bleeding from a field, who now trained cadets to see honor where it was hidden. But as she stood at the edge of the ground, waiting quietly, the young recruits treated her presence as an intrusion. "You don't even look like you belong in uniform," one muttered, loud enough for the group to laugh. Another mimicked the stiff stance she held. "Maybe she's just here for a free lunch." Elena did not move. Her silence was a fortress. Her eyes, fixed forward, never wavered. Yet each insult piled upon the air until the injustice thickened. Those watching said nothing. Bystanders shifted their weight, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Authority figures nearby allowed the scene to play out, measuring the woman they did not recognize against the pride of their young recruits. It was a cruelty more bitter than shouting. Mockery dressed as training. Disrespect paraded as humor. The cadets circled closer. One stepped forward, bold with the arrogance of youth. He leaned in, his voice a whisper meant for humiliation. "Tell me, Cadet, what's your little call sign? Do they call you Iron Feather? Or maybe just Lost Puppy?" The laughter rose again. Elena's jaw tightened, but she did not break her silence. She had stood before worse men, in darker places, and she had learned long ago that silence was not weakness. It was a weapon that unsettled the untested. And still, the tension built. Every moment stretched tighter, every insult hung heavier, until even those who mocked her began to sense that they were striking something far larger than they could comprehend. On her wrist, under the cuff of her sleeve, was a tattoo. Faded, black ink etched with the precision of a battlefield artist. A wolf's head crowned with iron thorns. The mark of her unit. The mark of Iron Wolf. Few outside the unit would recognize it. But those who did would never forget it. And one Marine standing nearby did recognize it. He had seen that emblem once before, in the aftermath of a firefight where he had been certain death would take him. The one who dragged him out had worn that very mark. The Marine rose. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, but the respect in them carried through the silence like a tide rising. Every cadet stilled. His eyes fell on Elena, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with recognition. And then he spoke words that froze the blood of every young man who had dared laugh. "Iron Wolf, stand by." The field went still. The recruits glanced at one another, confusion cutting through their arrogance. The Marine's words were not casual. They were not metaphor. They were command. Recognition. Elena's chin lifted slightly. She did not speak. She did not need to. The cadets who mocked her now saw what they had missed. The scars, the posture, the unwavering silence of someone who had already passed the trials they had not yet begun. The Marine stepped closer. His voice, though calm, carried the force of storms. "You call her Cadet?" he said, addressing the recruits. "You laugh at what you do not understand? That woman wore the Iron Wolf emblem before you ever learned how to salute. You train for war. She has already carried it on her shoulders." The cadets looked down. The laughter was gone, replaced by a silence that weighed heavy with shame. Elena remained still, silent, her dignity unshaken. The Marine turned toward them, his words etched into the moment like stone. "You measure soldiers by what you see. I measure them by what they've endured." And then, after a pause, he added, "Respect is not given to uniforms. It is given to sacrifice." The cadets swallowed hard, their faces burning. One by one, as though commanded by something deeper than orders, the recruits straightened. Their hands rose in salute. Not because they were told, but because something within them finally understood the weight of silence. Elena, still unshaken, returned the gesture with a crisp movement that carried more weight than medals. The field held its breath. Then, slowly, others around them rose to their feet. Instructors, officers, even bystanders who had remained silent now stood in respect. For a moment, it was no longer a parade ground. It was a place of recognition. A battlefield in memory, a sanctuary of honor in present time. And when it was over, Elena turned without a word and walked away. Not because she needed their validation, but because she had given them something far greater. A glimpse of what true strength looked like. The Marine's words lingered long after she left. The recruits would remember them for years to come, whispered as a lesson whenever arrogance threatened to blind them. They had mocked her as a cadet, but they had discovered that she was something far rarer, a living testament to silent strength. And in that moment, every soldier present learned the truth. Sometimes the loudest authority is silence carried with honor. Respect is not always worn in medals. Sometimes it is carried in scars. Sometimes it walks quietly among us, unnoticed until arrogance forces it into light. And sometimes, All it takes is one voice, steady, reverent, unshaken, to remind the world. Iron Wolf, stand by. If this story moved you, share where you're watching from in the comments. Tell us what respect means to you. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe, because every silent hero deserves to be remembered.